Thank you first of all to the invitation, both to your PDW and to have a short chat up front. Well, basically, you started with the most difficult question because I would not dare defining context, but I have a particular understanding of contexts, and that's one of the points. There is not just one context out there. And the other point is that it's many contexts, they operate on different levels. For example, it may be that entrepreneurs are impacted more by a social context very close to them and less by a regulatory or institutional context, which they perceive a bit farther away because that's national or regional regulations. But what is important as well is that contexts are not static. They are not just out there. They are dynamic. And one of the understandings I have here, which emerged from the research I've done over years in very, very many different cultures and countries, is that contexts do not simply emerge out of the blue. They are constructed by various actors and they are co-constructed. And these actors could be governments, could be communities, which puts us into the direction of cultural, institutional context. It could be, let's say, the way spaces and places are constructed and enacted, and it could be the entrepreneurs themselves. Different influences. I mean, looking at the context research, what we've seen there is that most of the earlier studies, which basically went beyond environment and looked at how do contexts influence entrepreneurship. So basically seeing it as a one-way street, the context as a variable or as a construct, depending on how you research it, and the way actually it or they influence entrepreneurship. And you're probably familiar with all the institutional theory studies which looked at how do regulations and regulatory changes influence entrepreneurship, etc., etc. That's what we would call the first wave of context studies, and they're very important because it kind of alerts us to that there is not just a static environment out there, but there is something like context happening on different levels and having an impact on the nature and the extent of entrepreneurship, and ultimately also on its diversity. And what in a study we've called second and third wave is basically differently, because it also kind of starts exploring, because I don't think we're at the end there, it starts exploring how do entrepreneurs impact or influence or construct or co-create or enact their context. And for me, that is really, really important, because that could happen, let's say, deliberately, like having in Germany, we have business associations of entrepreneurs, which kind of negotiate with government trying to change particular regulations. Yeah, that would be kind of a deliberate construction or enactment of context. But it could also happen involuntarily or with entrepreneurs just doing what they did it, like enacting opportunities, exploiting opportunities, and by that, either bypassing particular regulations or cultural rules, and over time changing them. That's something I've seen again and again when I did research in former Soviet countries in the so-called transition economies. Sometimes you find that in the literature where entrepreneurs exploit institutional voids. But most of what I have seen happened kind of like, okay, let's bypass this regulation. That's not something we can actually build our business on, or we can grow the business. And over time, that of course has an impact on regulatory environments as well. Let me start with who else works on this topic. I mean, to a certain extent, all entrepreneurship scholars work on different aspects of context, probably hidden, and not calling themselves contextual scholars. And I wouldn't actually dare kind of say everybody researches context, but a few people who are doing really interesting work on that. Dominic Chalmers, together with Eleanor Shaw, a few years ago, they started working on methodological issues around context. His work I like a lot. Then there is Stefan Korsgaard. He's a Danish scholar from Denmark, and again, I've collaborated with him. He comes from an understanding of looking at entrepreneurship in the rural, not necessarily rural entrepreneurship, because he makes a distinction here and saying entrepreneurship in the rural, what does it mean? And kind of rediscovering place and space, and basically kind of looking at that aspect of context. How do entrepreneurs influence or play around or use the rural context to develop their business? And where are they grounded in the rural, and where are they outgoing? And I think really interesting work, also because it may have implications for how do we look at internationalization, for example, of businesses. Two colleagues I work with, both of them are from the US, or let's say based in the US, are business historians. And that brings me back to one of my interests, my current or long-going interests, and that is history as a context. How does that influence entrepreneurship, and how does what has happened before influence how entrepreneurs act today? And is there something they can do to interact with the history? So we are working, and we did a special issue in Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal on time, context, and looking at that. Bill Gardner was in that as well. That was really interesting. We're following that up with various ideas we're working on at the moment. And to me, that is one project which is very close to my heart, because it's the looking back in order to look forward. Yeah, then you can understand history as something which kind of constrains you or restricts you, but you can also understand history as kind of resources. Yeah, and so how can you actually use history as a resource for entrepreneurship? So I've named Dan Vadvani and David Kirsch. Those are the business historians. Stefan Korsgaard, Dominic Chalmers, Sarah Dodd. Again, she's based in Glasgow, Strathclyde. I'm not sure she would call herself a contextual scholar, but I like the way she is currently imploring processes and very different processes than you normally would expect from an entrepreneurship scholar. What she's looking at, and that basically is my interest as well, she's looking into things like walking, yeah, and being out in nature. And why is that my interest? Because one of the bigger issues I'm currently working on, or let's say thinking through, just starting, is this place issue. And I want to connect that to different interests I have. One is, okay, how can you connect that to the whole nature literature? There is a literature of nature writing. What can we actually take from that to look at entrepreneurship anew? And the second issue is one of connecting it to planning, let's say spatial planning, urban design, architecture. And that story is quite interesting. My brother is an architectural historian, and he basically put me down that road when he talked about how 1920s houses created rooms, literally rooms for women, and women got emancipated through that. And I automatically thought, why haven't we explored that in relation to entrepreneurship? How does the spatial environment, the spatial context, influences how we enact entrepreneurship? Just think of incubators, think of makerspaces or something like that. Yeah. So those are some of the bigger things I'm working on, and I think I could. Oh yes, there is another couple, Alistair Anderson, who's worked on context. Unfortunately, he passed away recently, and his co-author. I should have written down that name. It probably will come to me in a minute.
So I know he's worked with Sarah Jack.
He worked with Sarah Jack and Sarah Dodd, but the co-author he's worked on context with is Gadefors. Can't remember his first name. Yeah. Okay, let me just, I will use history as an example, and I will use place as an example. And I think one of the big issues we need to get at is this contexts are dynamic. Yeah, because the tendency we always have is kind of seeing the big picture, and that is we have loads of context. We have the interplay with entrepreneurship. We have the interplay in between different contexts and across context. And as soon as we start researching that, it's like we break it down to little bits, but then we forget to put the big puzzle, put it in back into the big puzzle. So methodologically, I think there is an issue here around getting at the dynamics, probably in terms of multi-leveling. I'm not a quants person, yeah, and I see big possibilities and opportunities in that one. Getting at the dynamics in a different way, it's also getting at the dynamics of how entrepreneurs co-construct or enact their contexts. And one of the issues I looked in recently, both in the book I did with Ted Baker and in the forthcoming EDMP article, is what role does language and our visual seeing of context play? And again, I let the story because the visual thing arises out of my interest for photography. So I'm kind of dabbled into how does photography actually allows us to interpret what we see out there differently. There is literature out there in organization studies, for example, and in management in general, and there is an emerging study base in entrepreneurship looking at how do entrepreneurs pitch, what does it make with them, and less so on the visual side, because that's mainly used in a way like, okay, look at how entrepreneurs dress. But I think it would be way more important actually to look into that. So that's a big opportunity. When we take history, again, the dynamics would be interesting here. Yeah, how do historical narratives, how do cultural narratives, how do cultural memories actually influence how entrepreneurship happens today? We talked a bit about that in the forthcoming ETMP article, when we actually looked into examples like how do these cultural memories we all have, we all emerge from our own culture. We all know, okay, let's take the Ruhr area here in Germany, that's been the former coal and steel mining area. How did they manage to reinvent themselves? Have they really reinvented themselves? What does that mean for the type of entrepreneurship, the diversity of entrepreneurship? And again, it's like looking back to look into the future, but also understanding the dynamics. Where is it something which perpetuates the self? Because we all know, like the Silicon Valley story, that is I think it's an evergreen. Each time I talk to policymakers here in North Rhine-Westphalia, they talk to me about Silicon Valley entrepreneurship because they've recently been there, and say to them, you well, look into your own state. You've got very interesting, diverse entrepreneurship examples here. Yeah, and then the place issue again. I would like to link that as and there's big opportunities here again to these both of the quants modeling here, but what interests me as well, the more qualitative aspects of how our place is constructed. We touched upon spatial planning and architecture, and of course also the way, let's say, for example, how mining influenced places. Yeah, what does that mean for future entrepreneurship if a place is somehow both linked to a narrative and has been deconstructed or constructed in a particular physical way? Yeah. Narratives, languages, how do we talk about particular places? Not going to raise the Silicon Valley model again. So those are big opportunities. There's so much to do. I'm really looking forward to the future scholarship in that area.
So whether we look at history or geography, architecture, language, especially if we are looking at exploring the dynamism and change over time, it almost seems that one would want to engage in longitudinal, perhaps qualitative studies. But you're also saying that there might be opportunities for some quantitative research.
Yes.
I'm thinking aloud. I'm wondering aloud because I do qualitative research, but I also do experiments, and I'm wondering if experiments have a role to play at all, because with experiments, we tend to sort of zone down on certain variables and just focus on manipulation of those variables and see how it impacts actions and vice versa. But I'm just wondering aloud, and I wanted to hear your thoughts in terms of if we want to broaden our understanding of context, it almost seems that the fourth wave would entail more longitudinal studies, more qualitative studies, so that we can appreciate all the variables rather than trying to zone down on a particular variable.
Why not zoning down? It's like when you contextualize, you're arguing for the bigger picture. Yeah, but when you want to do empirical research, we all know that we probably will have to kind of, it's like a funnel. Yeah, we kind of will have to zone it down. What is important that you start broadening it again and saying, okay, what is it that I add to the bigger picture of some of the issues we've talked about by zoning down? And I like this question of experiments. You got me thinking now. Because they, let's take my rural area example. Wouldn't it be interesting to get out there and look at, okay, let's say those generations who have been thrown out of the mines, the coal mines and the steel works, and maybe kind of looking at their narratives in an experiment, and then looking at the younger generation, because the rural area now has a very vibrant creative industry scene. They've got startups and artificial intelligence. I'm just thinking aloud, yeah, because I'm not an experiment guy. Yeah, but wouldn't it be interesting in kind of trying to get at their narratives, yeah, and one way of actually looking at the dynamics, and where probably the elder generation dynamics could impede because they're stuck to okay, it has been this way, yeah, they're stuck in that. I could kind of restrict what's going on. I don't know. I hope it gives you some idea. Happy to explore that beyond this. Yeah.